This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you our panel discussion entitled Dilli to Delhi. The panelists are Dr. Swapna Liddle, eminent historian and author, Dr. Aishwarya Tipnis, leading heritage conservationist and architect, Shri Shyam Gopal Dewan, distinguished senior citizen, and Renuka Narayanan, columnist and author who initiates and moderates the discussion.
Good evening. In tonight's national program of talks, we'll be discussing the development of Delhi, our capital city, from its once upon a time story to its present frenetic avatar. We have a very interesting panel with us. Mr. Shyam Gopal Dewan, who is a respected senior citizen and octogenarian, has long memories of Delhi to share with us. We have Dr. Swapna Liddle, author and historian and well-known documenter of Delhi, and Dr. Aishwarya Tipnis, a Delhi girl who has become an internationally famous architect and a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters for her outstanding conservation work in Chandernagore and has present plans for Delhi. Welcome to you all. Let's get started by asking you, sir, what your earliest memories of Delhi are.
I remember there was a tram which used to run by electricity in Chandni Chowk. So it was my childhood.
And which decade was this?
60 up to 65.
It must have been fascinating growing up in the charming environs of Chandni Chowk back then. Could you tell us a little more about it?
I used to learn car driving in Chandni Chowk. So you can imagine how
empty it was. That sounds so unbelievable to us, despite the restoration work presently finished, in which only cycle rickshaws are allowed to ply.
And I have seen the Tongas. I have been so many times in the Tonga, and we used to shop after parking our car in front of the shops.
That seems like some kind of dream scene today. Chandni Chowk is now a walking street, right?
Yes.
Do you think that's a good move?
Yes, I think, because it is so much crowded. So government done good.
I remember as a schoolgirl in the 70s, going to Shishganj and having to plow my way through crowds there. So I guess it's something that's happened gradually in Delhi with the increase in population and vehicles and things like that. How do you see it, Swapna?
For me, I think less of my own memories because I have come to Delhi only in 85, which is in the history and the life of the city. It's a very short period. But I tend to look at it from the point of view of what people have said about it. And one thing that every historian knows is the only constant is change. So we talk in very nostalgic terms about how things have changed. And it was people 200 years ago or 150 years ago also who were sitting there lamenting as to how things have changed.
Is that so?
It's true. And, you have, for instance, one of the chroniclers of the city was Syed Ahmad Khan when he was a very young man, the man who...
Sir Syed of Aligarh.
Yes. And he grew up in Delhi. And he was talking in the 1840s about how the Yamuna, the water had decreased and all, because canals had been cut and water had been diverted. I don't know what he would think if he would see the Yamuna today, for instance.
It's just horrified.
Change is a constant. Every generation sees change. And it's interesting to see what you talk about when you talk about change.
That's a very interesting point you made, that people have kept lamenting about the deterioration of Delhi over time. Were there any others who notably lamented it?
It's also a fact that the most people who record their memories in this manner, today, of course, everybody records because we literally record through our phones, it's become so easy. But in older times, it was people who wrote whether essays or poetry, etc. And one of the great chroniclers of the time is Ghalib, for instance. And he lived through some momentous times. He lived through the East India Company's governance in Delhi, and then he lived through the revolt of 1857. And the way in which he laments what has gone after 1857 is interesting, because he laments the fact that spaces have changed. So he said there used to be this lovely bazaar every evening in front of the Jama Masjid, which used to have storytellers, it had jugglers, all these performance artists, as well as a lot of food and other kinds of hawkers and things, and that has gone. He laments the fact that the whole bazaar which used to happen, a whole Mela used to happen at the Yamuna Bridge every week, every Sunday, that's gone. The annual Phool Walon Ki Sair, which was a major festival for the city, which used to be held in Mehrauli, that has gone. So he laments those kind of things. It's people and places. But incidentally, one of the things that shows us is Delhi people have always liked a party. So whether it's, in Ghalib's time, today also we love our little festivals, our bazaars, our places of gathering, I guess. That's what it says.
In fact, King Ashoka, back in the 3rd century BC, used to scold the public in his edicts on their, predilection for partying. What you said really strikes a chord, because there was this very beautiful period when Delhi had these amazing festivals using our public spaces. For instance, Bhakti Utsav, if you remember that festival, it was an all India festival where people from all over the country came and performed on the slopes of the Nehru Park lawns. And it was like a 3-day picnic. You went in the evening with your little durry and you sat and listened and came away, in a sublime mood. That's over. Ananya, the dance festival at Purana Kila, which went on for 10 years, showcasing classical dancers from all over India in that spectacular backdrop. That's gone. So these are things one remembers that were celebratory and participatory and made good use of Delhi's wonderful spaces. Regarding which, Aishwarya, I would love to have your thoughts and some indication of your plans on how you think Delhi can use its spaces better, and the people to public space relationship can be improved.
I think cities are made by people, and spaces become places only when there are people in it.
Quite right.
And every generation has within their memory an association with what they did, and that's what makes these places really special. Whether it was, going to Connaught Place and having an ice cream, or, when Nirula's opened up, there were queues with people trying to eat pizza just in Connaught Place.
I remember when a margarita was rupees 750.
So when we talk about, what are Delhi's public spaces and why they have, why aren't they important anymore? There are multiple reasons for them. People have changed. People don't go out anymore. And particularly in a post-pandemic situation, we have all learned a new way to live. And we've also realized that we do need to mingle, we need to interact. And how can spaces become meaningful back in our lives? So maybe this is the right point in time to ask this question: how can public spaces make a difference to us today? But more than anything else, I think we have to also acknowledge that people are driven into this because of the situation we are in, the safety and all of those issues that deter people from going into public spaces and using them.
I wonder if I might ask here, Aishwarya, do you think malls have become the new congregational spaces because they're air-conditioned, because it's free entry, and because there's amusement on every floor?
I think to some extent, I think places have a popularity index. So when they are new, everybody wants to go there. And then after some time, when the charm goes away, people stop going to. There are malls that have stopped functioning altogether. Places also change. It takes a lot for a public space to remain constant as generations change and their way of living or their way of transportation changes. For example, if you would talk to someone who was in Delhi in their 70s and they talk about picnics being Qutub Minar and Lodi Garden, and a city, its image was around the monuments from the earlier age. Today, even in popular culture, when they talk about Delhi, the scene is not the Qutub Minar anymore. It's the buzzing lines of the metro, the overhead metro. So the way people experience the city has changed. The way people see the city has changed. And so maybe it is time to reinterpret how they will deal with public space in the city.
That seems such a genuine observation of how we've changed as a city. And I know the change happened simply from the fact that, as you said, once upon a time, and I'm sure Mr. Shyam Gopal will agree, that earlier our lives were centered in the gardens around monuments. And now we usually go to a food court and a mall, depending on which is the mall of preference at the moment. So would you say that you too have changed in this way?
Yes, we have changed ourselves. But previously I used to go in Gauri Shankar Mandir and Chandni Chowk. My building is also there opposite to it, E.S. Pyarelal building. Then there is another building which is the biggest Sunnamal Walon ki building, 3,000 square yards. My building is 800, and there are so many chaat things like jalebi of the river, you must have heard, and so many chaat things are there. So you enjoy at every place in every street. Paranthe wali gali, you must have heard. All kinds of paranthas are there. So you enjoy going over there. So eatables everywhere you will find. All asli hi, so कहना चाहिए ना.
It sounds like a whole slice of life.
Yeah.
But tell me, Swapna, do you think this is a characteristic of Delhi, that it divides itself into slices of life? I wonder if people have noticed this before.
Complexity, of course, is the hallmark of any large metropolis like Delhi is. And Delhi has been a very diverse sort of a culture for a very long time. Even in very ancient times, it was on major trade route, one of the branches of the Uttar Path. And as a result, people passed through, many of them stayed back, and everybody has added their culture to it. And that may be language. Most importantly, I think it is food. People bring their own food and add it to the city. And again, what happens is that city people by nature are more outward looking and more accepting of change and change to their habits. So you may be from anywhere, but you're happy to taste somebody else's food, maybe try it out. I always go back to history. So there is another poet of the early 19th century who writes, Insha writes this. He writes this. It's called the Darya-e-Latafat. It's a history of the language of the city. But some of the samples he uses as to illustrate are, one of the conversations is about a lady who's come from outside and she's castigating her, neighbor and saying that these women of Delhi, they are always getting food from outside. Don't they cook in their homes? So, even 200 plus years ago, people were literally ordering in.
That's so interesting.
There were these people,
Street culture.
Even earlier there used to be these all sorts of, even in Old Delhi, it's still there. These itinerant hawkers who pass by with their food offerings, and it's all different times of the day. Somebody's coming in the morning, somebody's coming in the evening. They have their times, and there are some summer specialities. There are winter foods that people have, and you can sit in your home literally and get everything in.
Very true and appealing aspect of Delhi. In fact, I remember in the 70s in Daryaganj, they used to sell kheera and kakdi ke lache, fingers of cucumber and carrot, and they would be calling out Laila ki ungliyan, Majnu ki pasliyan.
Right.
Do you remember that, sir? That was such a the fingers of Laila and the ribs of Majnu. I thought that was such a romantic way to sell a crunchy vegetable. But the other thing I noticed, and I'll just come to you in a minute, Aishwarya, I wanted to ask Swapna one more thing. This aspect of Delhi, that it's always been a city of immigrants, did it create a sort of social hierarchy or a snobbery of its own?
Yes, of course. But I think it's been, at different times, it's different criteria that are used. So, for instance, in the 19th century, it was all about who spoke the perfect, the purest Urdu, and the newcomers whose language was not quite so refined, maybe looked down upon, that kind of stuff. Nobody was precluded from aspiring to get to that. Yes. And, you had these kind of stratifications that happened, and there was this, every era has its own stratifications. I mean, Aishwarya was talking about the kind of, malls. Why malls are not, they may be the new novelty from time to time, but they are never very lasting simply because also they're not very inclusive. You may say that it's free to enter, but there are people who will feel uncomfortable getting in there. It's not quite the same as, say, an India Gate is.
No, of course not. That is such a widely accepting and inclusive space. It's public gardens. Yes. I think the entire Andruni Sheher or the walled city comes there for a breather. It's their lung, But I was actually also thinking of something you mentioned, which was Niraj Chaudhry's reaction to Delhi, to living in Delhi. When did he come here and what was that all about?
I was talking about that earlier. And he's interesting because he came from Calcutta, which was another very sort of cosmopolitan space. And he came to Delhi and he, in fact, worked in All India Radio. He worked
in this very building.
In this very building, which was coming up, which had just come up then. And he lived in the old city in near Kashmiri Gate. And he had one of the things he noticed about Delhi, which a lot of newcomers notice about Delhi even today, is that everybody was very, very conscious of the address. Where does one live? What type of, if you're in government service, what type of house you live in, which immediately slots you in the mind of the other person as to your social status, etc. So he said that, in fact, he noticed that, and he said, in fact, when I say that I live in Old Delhi, I'm like just put beyond the pale altogether. I'm completely out of it.
Oh dear, this is the new social Sarkari class that was evolving, no doubt. Aishwarya, do you think the city is still divided according to social position or official position? Is it still a Sarkari city, or has that character changed and it's added new identities?
I think, of course, there is a layer of the Sarkar. You can't take that away from the diplomatic enclave and areas around it, which are
Government
colonies. But I think what is interesting is the different communities that have now taken over many spaces. So you already know that if you're talking about a Khirki village and there is immigration from the African community and it is their hub now, or if it is the Afghan community living in Lajpat Nagar. So I think Delhi, like Swapna said, has always had layers of people coming in. So the partition and all of the refugees that came in and settled in Malviya Nagar and things like that. There are people who are constantly coming, and that is why we are now a city with the population of almost 2 crores of people, because people don't stop coming in. However, I am born and brought up in Delhi, and I have seen this change. There's a disconnect with the city. So now people are interested in coming, living, doing their thing and going away. But the love for the city is not as it used to be. So even when in the 80s, when people were living in other parts of the Delhi, they still very much identified with the city and with its different things that you would do in a city. Today, it's more, the gated communities. Communities have become very fragmented, and people are only concerned with their own community. They're not concerned with what happens outside the gate. And I think that is one of the main problems why we have this huge security concern in the city, which wasn't there so many years ago. And that's not just Delhi's problem. I think it's an entire problem of globalization and access to money and migration, and all of those global problems are affecting us at a local level. So the dependence on the car, I think, is not just because of aspiration, but it's also because of the safety issue. When I was younger, we used to walk into the neighborhood market. It would take us 10 minutes to walk. Today, there are no footpaths to walk. So
it's all dug up, actually.
What would you walk on? So I think that's why you're forced to go in the car, even if you don't want to. And I think, you asked me a question earlier about what are my plans for the city. I think it's time that we stopped putting so much of emphasis on what planners do and what architects do and what engineers do, and bring the power to the actual people and the communities and how they can do things for their own spaces and stuff around them. It's really about becoming bottom up, and that's what is the way forward. It's about how people can make a change themselves and not what governments and planners can do sitting in their offices.
Could you give us an example of how this can be a people's up movement?
There are many initiatives in the city that work with people and raising awareness about their surroundings, about environment, about heritage and things like that. But I think there are many initiatives that happen on their own, whether it is the RWAs trying to do something about cleanliness in their neighborhoods, or it is Shopkeepers Association trying to maintain things.
Dustbins.
So initiatives are multiple. They all exist. But what I think we really need to do is give them power to do something bigger. So if, for example, hypothetically, all the shopkeepers of Chandni Chowk want to do something and all the Vyapar Mandals come together, big change can happen. We don't need to wait around for a councillor or a MP or someone to come around and do things. So small things make a difference. And I think it's time that we created the environment for those small changes to happen, because it makes a big impact.
Sir, do you think this can happen according to what Aishwarya said in Chandni Chowk, for instance?
Yes, she is 100% right. And I will say that Chandni Chowk is famous because of its galiyan, streets, which now malls have come into existence. But previously, every street has its own specialization. For example, if you want to purchase some books or something like that, you go to Nayi Sadak. If you want to purchase clothes, you go to this place. If you want to purchase jewelry, go to Dariwa. Something like that. They themselves made it famous because of their own profession. If you remember, कौन जाए दिल्ली की गलियां छोड़कर, इस तरह से ज़िंदगी को आसान कर लिया मैंने किसी को माफ़ कर दिया, किसी से माफ़ी मांग ली, किसी से माफ़ कर दिया मैंने. तो गालिब he used to live in street Balli Maran.
Next to yours.
Yes, you may say he was my neighbor. So streets are also very, very famous because of Dilli or Chandni Chowk.
But now you live in South Delhi, so what prompted the move? Because that too is your changing relationship with Delhi.
We have still our house in Old Delhi, very big house, but now I shifted to Bengali market, South Delhi, you may say.
Technically central, would you say?
But it is so much crowded.
In the old city.
In the old city, you don't want to live over there.
Oh dear. This is a sorry reflection not only on the walled city, but on many bastis of Delhi. For instance, I live very close to a historical village called Begumpur. And it has a fine mosque from the 14th century. I see it when I walk in the big park. You can see the mosque against one wall of the park. But when I attempted to go in there to explore it, I'm not able to access that place, which is under ASI lock and key. But people have put their charpais there. And it's not a very visitor-friendly place, you know, however much you might want to see it. So in a situation like this, Aishwarya, when you say people have to take the initiative to change things, how does one actually bring about this awareness? Because it's not there in tracts of Delhi at present. And again, I'm saying this with a great deal of hesitation because I don't want to sound like, you know, like I'm making some kind of judgment. But nevertheless, there is a ground reality that one would like to address if possible.
You know, in my experience, I think everyone loves heritage. You know, it's about what language you talk to them in. Sometimes it's not just about telling people ye karo, that this is what you should do, but it's about also asking them what would you like to do. And that's where empowerment begins. I think there are lots of school programs and there are lots of people who take, you know, kids out to show them what the city has to offer. But if you remain a spectator, that's what you do. You come, you see, you consume, you go away. What I'm talking about is making them active citizens and helping people to feel that they can contribute to doing something in the city. Whoever they may be, it doesn't matter. You're a 14-year-old child or you're a 46-year-old adult, it doesn't matter. The point is the intent, and the intent to come together and do something collaboratively. That's what makes the difference. So as I was giving you a very simple example of RWAs. Now, and every colony has an RWA. There are some people who are really interested in bringing other things together for everyone's good, you know. So they make sure streets are clean, they make sure gardens are done up, they make sure that there is security. So I'm saying that what you can do for your own enclave, you can also do for the city. So it's time to scale that up. It's time to say, what can people do? Everyone brings in a different skill set. Some people can talk about change. Some people have the influence to influence policy, to bring about change. Some people have influence to, you know, help the economy by, you know, either opening some shops or creating events around it. It's time we stop looking at the city as a place of consumption to a place of well-being, to a place that gives us an everyday life.
That's a beautiful way to put it, as a place of well-being. Swapna, how do you think, you know, as an activist in this field, how do you think we might address an issue like, say, the Begumpur Mosque?
Begumpur Mosque again has a very interesting history because historically, for a long time, it was occupied by people.
People lived inside.
I
see.
Myself spoken to people who remembered that time. It was acquired in the 1910s when the Archaeological Survey of India acquired a lot of monuments, you know, when New Delhi was coming up. And they kicked all these people out. They acquired their property, they kicked them out, and those are the people who settled around this. You know, that's the nucleus of the village of Begumpur. You know, you look at it from their point of view. This is a place which was their home. They have been evicted from there. And retrospectively, their buildings now become encroachments. You know? So, in fact, Begumpur is an excellent example because what happens is the ASI decides that it has to keep out people at any cost. It locks the place up. As a result, all people who would do harmless things inside go in there. Why can't they have their little meetings there, you know, sit out in the evening? You know, there is not very much space outside. You know, why can't it not be a place where people do things which are compatible with the building, not damaging the building? But because you have kind of almost criminalized any kind of this kind of use, the only people who are in there then are those who are up to no good. who are vandalizing, etc. So
The drinks club, the boys club.
Yeah, we have to find ways in which people who live, particularly in these sensitive areas around monuments, etc., are given a stake in the upkeep of the place and say that, if we keep this stuff together, then it'll benefit everybody.
Yeah, carrying on from that point, exactly. When decisions are made on a map, it excludes the people who really have anything to do with that place.
Well
So
said.
when you draw red lines around monuments and say this is prohibited area, you have no idea what you have done to that community. You have fractured that community by drawing a line through people's homes. You have also impacted a lot of people, like so many people I know who lived in areas like Green Park and Hoskas and, Panchsheel. Suddenly one day they came to know they can't even drive a nail into their building because they are in 100 meters of a monument, because a law has come which says 100 meters from a monument. So if someone lives at the edge of that 100 meter, my neighbor can build a 4-floor story house because they are beyond the 100-meter line, and I can't. There is a lot of resentment in people with heritage laws and planning laws because it excludes people. It encroaches on their right to property or a right to life. Right. So I think
So it's peculiar to Delhi particularly.
no, this is a
because there's
national.
so many monuments.
This is a national law. But the point is that as long as we continue with a top-down system that some experts will decide what happens to the fate of the city, this is going to continue in different ways. I mean, there is a movement right now about, projects that are linking to the riverfront development, and there are protests by villagers and farmers and lots of NGOs supporting them that it's going to take away their livelihoods.
I particularly wanted to ask all three of you about why the Yamuna no longer exists as part of Delhi's life. Aishwarya?
I think it exists part of Delhi's life, but that life is very different from our life because there's so much stratification in the city. There are people who live by the river, there are people who farm by the river, there are people who use those ghats every day. And then there are people like us who use those ghats on Durga Puja to, immerse the idols. So of course it's a part of our everyday life. It's just not in the form that we would like it to be.
Not like a promenade or a sit out or a nice charming riverfront.
I would say Yamuna is still, it's Yamuna. I mean, it has its own identity. But when we try to force it to become the Thames is when the problem starts to happen. Because there was a, London Eye kind of thing that was plonked at Kalindi Kunj some 15 years ago because it wanted to be like the London Eye.
The London.
Yeah, there was a structure that was put up there. So I think the problem really is a whole lot of planners or people or all, they want Delhi to become something else, but not take into account how complex and how beautiful and how enriching it really is. It's got everything for all kinds of people. I think that's the thing. It's not just a city for service class people. It's a city for everyone. It's a city for the rich. It's a city for the poor. And everyone has their own version of the city.
That is so passionately argued. What do you say, sir?
I will just like to bring to your notice that Manoj Kumar, actor, director, producer, Motilal, Mukesh, Pran, he used to live in Ballimaran.
It's fascinating, the mosaic that is Delhi, the organic and pulsating mosaic that is Delhi. And I would like to ask you, Swapna, whether you think this kind of documentation made accessible to people, and if so, who should be doing it? Should the MLAs be doing it? Is there a tract that can be made and be given from constituency to constituency to make people aware of some of the things Aishwarya has been talking about?
Well, if you're talking about the history of the city, it's very simple. We don't even have a city museum. I think we don't look at our city and how it has grown. I think we need to be looking at that first. And as far as our vision of the city goes, I think this idea of beautification is something that should go. It is not about cosmetic changes that are aesthetically pleasing. We should be looking at lives of people, how things affect their quality of life. That is what we should be looking at.
I think that is a beautiful summary of Delhi's current situation. And I thank all of you for the very interesting and valuable things you've said. And I just hope this will carry on into, concrete action. Concrete may be the wrong word to use here, but Aishwarya can correct that. And I think it's really down to people making a city and generating the dynamics of a space. So all three of you are very deeply aware of it. And thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights into our life and our capital.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
In the national program of talks tonight, you were listening to a panel discussion entitled Dilli to Delhi. The panelists were Dr. Swapna Liddle, eminent historian and author, Dr. Aishwarya Tipnis, leading heritage conservationist and architect, Shri Shyam Gopal Dewan, distinguished senior citizen, and Renuka Narayanan, columnist and author, who initiated and moderated the discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.